And the subject of today's heel or face video is the Animal Batista, one of the biggest world heavyweight champions that the WWE produced since the turn of the century, and someone who's gone on to have some pretty good success for himself outside of wrestling when you look at his movie roles. I thought he stole the show in Blade Runner 2049. It's a small role, but he was fantastic in it. He played the Heavy in a Bond movie, he was in Dune, and his biggest roles to date are his films where he plays Drax the Destroyer in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. Big entries in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So Batista done quite well for himself outside of wrestling, but in wrestling we're going to be talking about whether or not he worked better as a heel or as a face. Now, typically when I do these videos, and granted this is only the second one, but I've got more planned, and my goal is to kind of take a comprehensive look at their entire career and just kind of determine whether or not the wrestler being spotlighted worked better as a heel or a face. And I think in Batista's case, you really only have to look at his time from when he went to Raw and joined Evolution in 2003 onward. Anything that happened before that, largely irrelevant. He was Leviathan in OVW, where he kind of got his feet wet as a monster in the making, and then there was his run as Deacon Batista, which I'm sure nobody involved wants to remember any of that. So we'll start from when he joined the Raw brand in 2003 and joined Evolution. That was where Batista started to come into his own, and it's funny that everything worked out the way it did, because originally he wasn't even supposed to be in Evolution. It was supposed to be Mark Jindrak in that role, and Batista ended up taking it, and I think it worked out for the better. We'll never know how Mark Jindrak could have done. Maybe he'd be the one getting the movie roles now had he been the one put into Evolution as originally planned. But I think Batista rounded out the group quite nicely, because you had Ric Flair, who was like the past star, the past main eventer and World Heavyweight Champion. You had Triple H, who was the established current-day main eventer and World Heavyweight Champion. And you had Randy Orton, who was the prodigy that was being groomed for main event success. And then you had Batista as the big, muscle-bound enforcer heavy of the group, something that he had a perfect look for, because, and I'll credit Jim Cornette with this line, he said in a shoot interview once that, take one look at Batista, he's main event or nothing. And I think, I agree with that sentiment, and I'm not saying it to put Batista down, because there are certain guys like that, where you look at them and it's like, this guy has to be a world champion. He's got too good of a look to spoil as a generic heavy that wrestles second match on the card, or as a guy that does a bunch of jobs for the up-and-comers, like kind of like a gatekeeper role. He's just got that main event superstar look to him, so he's got to be a top guy. He's just got that look and that presence to him. If you can get him to a point where he's a halfway decent worker, I think he can get him there. Again, Goldberg's that way, Ultimate Warrior's that way. I would argue maybe Lex Luger is that way to some degree, where it's like they have such a great superstar look. It's like you gotta set him up to win the belt at some point. So Batista definitely one of those guys, and I think he did quite well for himself. Now initially he was a heel in Evolution, and like I said, a role that he filled perfectly as the enforcer heavy, to kind of beat up on people and again round out the Evolution group, add something different to the mix that the other three members didn't have. But then he got put into the main event spotlight when he got that big main event against Triple H at WrestleMania 21, turned face, turned against Evolution, and took the spotlight for himself, getting the big win on the grand stage of WrestleMania. And also crowned on that same night was John Cena, winning his very first WWE Championship, and this was kind of the birth of the two big new champions of the generation. And Batista, very much like John Cena, very much like Randy Orton, and like Brock Lesnar, all came from that 2002 class, which is like the biggest developmental class in the history of wrestling when you look at the stars that came out of it. For better or for worse, regardless of how you feel about those stars, it's like, look, they produced a lot of talent from that class, so it's worth bringing up. But in Batista's case, he was taken on a separate path from John Cena, and what they did was they kind of had their two big new babyface champions, and they let each one kind of be the star of their own brand. And this was a great setup for Batista, as he was ultimately moved to SmackDown and became the top star of the SmackDown brand. And this was perfect for him because I did not like John Cena. I was not a John Cena guy, and even back then, when he still had a little bit of an edge to him, I could see him kind of becoming like, oh, he's going to be the kids champion. He's going to be, the women think he's cute, and the kids love him because he's the colorful, bright Captain America guy. And the kids are going to flock to him, and he's that champion. Sure enough, he evolved into that and took on that role. Again, for better or worse, regardless how you feel about John, he did what was asked of him, and he took on that role. But an older fan like myself, I was in college at this point. I was like, I don't want, doopy-doo cartoon character scene. I want a cool, badass kind of guy. I want somebody with a little bit of an edge to him. Or if they're going to be the big, over-the-top superhero, they got to be psychotic and crazy like Hogan or Warrior. Like, they've got to be somebody cool like that. Batista definitely scratched that itch, whereas, like, I wanted somebody cool to just beat up on people, and he filled that role perfectly. He was great as top babyface, and a perfect answer for the people who didn't like John Cena. And this is one of those key moments where it's like, when with the brand split, and WWE hasn't always handled the brand split all that well, but this was one case where I was definitely more of a SmackDown guy over the Raw guy, because I look at Raw and it's like, look, they've got that stupid Eminem, not even Eminem, like Vanilla Ice wannabe as their top guy. He sucks, and I can't stand him. But this cool demon-looking guy who's jacked as all get out, big as a brick wall, and just mows over people and beats up on all the swarmy heels like the JBLs of the world. I'm like, this guy's cool. I like him. I like Batista. So Batista was kind of my guy during that era of WWE. And it was an interesting setup they had where they could have like a choice between the two. And I thought Batista did very, very well as a babyface. Better than you would expect. Because you look at him, Batista's one of those guys, he just has like a mean look to him. And he just kind of naturally looks like a heel. If he were around in the 1980s, he would have been working with Hogan. If he was around in the 90s, he would have been in the Dungeon of Doom and still working with Hogan. He's just got... Hogan would have taken one look at him and it's like, I want to work with that guy, brother. Because, Hogan knows his bread and butter. It's like, I need monsters, bro. And I don't know why I went into Vince Russo there for Hogan. But in any case, Batista at this point... worked surprisingly well as a babyface and was very, very cool. And of course, I live in Maryland near the DC area. He's a bit of a local hero around here, so he's very well liked in the DC area. So that was another thing that kind of fueled that fandom. He was kind of not quite a hometown boy for me personally. I'm from Silver Spring, Maryland, but close enough to where I could kind of consider him a hometown boy. And he was just cooler than Cena, and more fun to watch than Cena. And again, this is one of those things where it's like, oh, but star ratings this and star ratings that. It's like, dude, that's not even... That's a conversation that doesn't matter to me at all. It's like, look, can you grip me? Can you grab me? Can you keep my attention? And can you make me want to root for you? And Cena couldn't do that through most of his run as a main eventer. And I've said many times before, for me, my favorite Cena matches are the ones where he's kind of the de facto heel, like the match with Daniel Bryan at SummerSlam, the match with Punk at Money in the Bank, the match with Rob Van Dam at One Night Stand. It's the matches where he's the heel, even though they don't call him a heel or present him as a heel. He's the heel in those situations, and that's when John worked best for me. Batista, on the other hand, he was cool. Like, I loved him. I thought he was great, and it's a shame he got hurt when he did. Because he absolutely could have headed into WrestleMania 22 as the champion. I don't think anybody would have been opposed to it. And he had a very nice main event run going there. There was also the feud he had with Eddie that unfortunately got cut short because of Eddie's untimely passing. So there was a lot of good stuff going on with Batista over on SmackDown, and unfortunately his injury kind of cut it short. But after that he came back, and he was never quite able to get to that same level of... how do I want to phrase this? Like, he was never quite as over, at least with me, as he was during that initial 05 leaning into 06 period. that was when Batista, I felt, was at his best. He also got hurt a couple of times, unfortunately, which kind of halted his momentum a few times. But I never disliked Batista. He was always like, oh yeah, it's Batista, he's cool. And he would have like big matches every once in a while with like a Booker T or, which, you know, we all know how the Booker T match got on the books and how that got started. But, you know, Mr. Kennedy and things like that. So he was a reliable big name to put into big matches and big situations when they needed him to. And this ultimately led to him having a massive, even though it wasn't the closing match, it felt like a main event. The match with Undertaker at WrestleMania 23, which I thought was great. Probably my favorite Batista match. And it was something that, you know, you looked at the SmackDown brand at that point in time, you know, it was riddled with injuries and just, it felt like snake bit because it was like, every time I turned around, somebody on SmackDown was getting hurt or getting drug busted or something was happening. But they were able to deliver this one big match, The Undertaker versus Batista at WrestleMania, and it delivered in spades. I thought it was a wonderful match. Great stuff. They had a few rematches after that. I don't think they ever quite recaptured that same magic, but it still felt like a big-time match because it felt like Batista was somebody that could believably match up against Undertaker. He had the size, the credibility, and the main event stardom to do that. Now, during this period, he was kind of like I've said with Cena at various points, he was kind of the de facto heel, although he wasn't really a heel, so that part of the dynamic was a little muddled. It wasn't really a strictly heel-face dynamic. It was just, hey, we've got these two big stars. Let's have them fight each other. So it wasn't quite face versus face either. It was just kind of like almost like an MMA-style scenario where it's you pick the one to root for and you just kind of go for it. And most people picked Undertaker in that scenario. So I don't want to call that a heel run for Batista because it wasn't really. It was just kind of like the scenario that they had set up. It was for all intents and purposes, it was kind of a face versus face match, although it wasn't strictly that dynamic either. But I don't consider that a heel run for Batista. He didn't really turn heel until 2009 when they were setting him up for his WrestleMania program with John Cena, which on paper seemed like a really good idea. They did have that match at SummerSlam '08, which again, terrific match. And that match was cool because it was like, all right, it's the guy that the kids picked in John Cena, or the one that represents the kids, and then there's the one that represents like the men that want badass motherfuckers that just kill people. In Batista, it is those two champions being put together at SummerSlam for a big match. Again, not the main event, but a big-time match between the two, with Batista getting the win, which made me very happy, and I marked out, because I thought for sure Cena was going to win, and he didn't. And I was like, yeah, my guy won. Cool. But then when it was time to do the match at WrestleMania 26, and the program that followed soon after, because they had a bunch of rematches, because of course they did. The WrestleMania program didn't really grip me all that much because they turned Batista heel, and in that scenario, it's like, well, John's gonna win this one, because he's, you've made Batista the clear-cut heel in this scenario. And not that Batista was bad at it per se. I think he did the best he could with the material he was given, but it wasn't a glamorous heel run, at least in my opinion, because it felt like he was just being served up to John Cena. And sure enough, that's pretty much exactly what happened. If memory serves me right, Cena won pretty much all the rematches, too. So it kind of by turning heel, it almost kind of reduced Batista to the level of a standard John Cena opponent, somebody that John needed to work with to overcome the odds and get another win. So I wasn't the biggest fan of that particular run from Batista. And then after that, he would kind of come and go. That was kind of the end of his big run with the company, and then he would just kind of come and go over the years. There was that failure of a run in 2014 where they tried to make him a top face, and the fans just completely rejected it because they were fully behind Daniel Bryan. And that didn't work at all. So they turned him heel out of necessity because the fans just wouldn't have it any other way. And there was a brief Evolution reunion and feud with The Shield, which worked well enough. Batista felt like he was just kind of filling a spot at that point, though. And it wasn't necessarily a glamorous run for him. It was actually more, that feud was more the beneficiary, The Shield were more the beneficiaries of that feud, and ultimately Seth Rollins, who did his big heel turn and destroyed the group. But Batista was kind of again, just kind of filling a spot, filling a necessary spot in that regard. So while he looks like a heel, or at least a traditional heel from when I grew up and started watching wrestling, Batista never really got like what I consider to be a great heel run, unless you count his early days in Evolution, where he was just kind of like the muscle-bound heavy of the group that was slowly developing and slowly becoming something much bigger down the road. So on paper, you would think that Batista would be a better heel than a face, because he's got the look for it, he's got the size for it, and everything about him. But ultimately, I'm gonna say I actually kind of prefer Batista as a face. And I know that might be a controversial decision for some, but there was a point in time where it was him and John Cena, and it's like, all right, pick your favorite top babyface champion, and I was more of a Batista guy, definitely, and I think it was kind of that, almost a recreation of that kind of Hogan Warrior dynamic from the late 80s and early 90s, where it's like, all right, who's your favorite champion? And the kids kind of had to decide, and this was a similar scenario here, and I think a lot of us older fans, we kind of gravitated more towards Batista, because again, he looked cool, he sounded cool, his theme music was awesome. Everything about him was just cool, so he was fun to root for. And whenever you put him in there with somebody like a JBL or like a Kennedy, who's kind of this obnoxious heel, it was fun to watch him beat him up. And that was the appeal of someone like a Batista. So, I know, again, controversial decision probably, but I'm actually going to go with Batista working better as a babyface, at least for me. I think he's one of the biggest babyface champions that they've created, again, since the turn of the century. And I think he did quite well in that role. He was never really able to recapture that magic from 05, 06, I feel. It certainly didn't happen when they had him come back and win the Rumble over Daniel Bryan. That didn't work at all. But that initial run there, that was a really great run for him. And that's when I think back on Batista, that's what I remember the most about him. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pick Batista as a babyface being my preference for him. So there you go.